On March 2, 1942, Japanese destroyers found USS Perch beneath the Java Sea. Depth charges had already compressed her hull inward by about 2 feet, and water poured through 17 separate breaches as she kept diving. By every engineering calculation, she should have imploded in the next minute, but she held together. On deck, her captain vented compressed air and fuel to the surface, hoping the oil slick and bubbles would convince the destroyers the submarine was wrecked. Below, 59 men froze in absolute silence as bulkheads groaned and toxic fumes filled the air. Their boat was dying and they were trapped. USS Perch took shape at the Electric Boat Yard in Groton, Connecticut, in early 1935. She was a Porpoise-class submarine. Her keel was laid on February 25, 1935, and she was launched on May 9, 1936. Sponsored by Mrs. Thomas Withers, Helen Lorena Withers. Commissioned that November, Perch measured just over 300 feet from bow to stern, with a beam of about 26 feet and a draft of roughly 15 feet. On the surface, she displaced about 1,350 long tons. Submerged, that jumped to nearly 2,000 long tons. 4 powerful 16-cylinder Winton diesel engines spun generators that powered electric motors, giving Perch enough thrust to push through the open sea at just over 19 knots, around 22 knot. Submerged, speed fell to under 9 knots and could only be held for a limited time before battery reserves ran low, forcing the boat to surface or reduce speed drastically. Her surface range at cruising speed was roughly 11,000 nautical miles, making her well suited for long Pacific patrols. Perch was built for patrol and strike. She carried 6 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 2 aft, and 16 torpedoes, a 4-inch deck gun for attacking small ships without wasting torpedoes, and 2 twin 30-caliber machine guns for limited anti-air and close-in defense. These weapons complemented one another, but each had limits. Torpedoes could fail. The deck gun required surfacing and exposed the boat, and the machine guns offered only thin protection against heavier threats. Her crew typically numbered around 5 officers and 45 enlisted men in cramped quarters built for endurance on long patrols, though wartime conditions sometimes meant extra hands aboard. In 1937, Perch joined Submarine Squadron 6 of the Pacific Fleet and operated in northern waters, including the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. In the spring of 1939, she cruised with the fleet to the U.S. East Coast, then returned west to Manila and became a division flagship. From the Philippines, she patrolled the China coast in 1940, visiting Qingdao and Shanghai, and spent the months before open war watching Japan's movements closely. 1 week before Pearl Harbor, she escorted the 4th Marine Regiment out of China, meeting transports off Shanghai and delivering them safely to the Philippines. War reached Perch just after dawn on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. She was moored at Cavite Navy Yard in the Philippines under Lieutenant Commander David A. Hurt when the first alerts arrived. 2 days later, Japanese bombers swept over Cavite, turning the yard into a raging firestorm that destroyed much of the Navy's local infrastructure and forced surviving ships and personnel to clear the wreckage and withdraw. With the base crippled and enemy forces closing, Perch got underway, slipping through the minefields off Corregidor and beginning her first wartime patrol in the waters between Luzon and Formosa. On that first patrol, Perch hunted Japanese shipping, reporting movements and attacking where she could. On December 25th, she fired 4 torpedoes at a large merchantman. The shots missed. A few days later, she struck again, torpedoing the Nojima Maru. Escorts closed in and Perch could not observe the result, but the ship was later confirmed damaged and stranded. After weeks of hard hunting and minor damage, Perch steamed south to Darwin, Australia for repairs. Perch was turned around quickly for a second patrol. She slipped out of Darwin on February 3, 1942, as the Japanese advanced through the Netherlands East Indies. From early to late February, she prowled the islands, scouting enemy concentrations and searching for convoys. During these actions, she took hits and suffered damage. In a night surface engagement off Celebes, a high-explosive shell struck the superstructure and conning tower, blowing away the bridge deck, puncturing antenna trunks and temporarily putting her radio out of commission. Repairs were made at sea as best they could, but by late February, Perch was badly worn down and still in the Java Sea when enemy destroyers closed. After the crushing depth charge attacks in early March, damage control kept Perch from immediate destruction, but she was crippled. The commanding officer and crew fought to keep her afloat. And when the decision was finally made to abandon and scuttle the submarine, the entire complement of 59 men got off. They were rescued by Japanese ships and taken prisoner. Most survived the war, though several later died in captivity. The Perch slipped beneath the waves and was later discovered as a wreck in the Java Sea decades after the battle. It struck the conning tower's antenna trunk dead on, crushing the metal framework and severing critical radio cables. From that moment forward, Perch could still receive transmissions through auxiliary antennas, but her ability to transmit was severely compromised. She could barely push signals more than a few miles, a crippling limitation for a submarine that needed to report enemy positions to headquarters. 2 days later, she reported a sighting. 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers just off the coast of Java. That was the last clear message anyone received. Perch had been ordered to head for Fremantle, Australia after her patrol. On February 28th, her final orders arrived: disregard previous patrol boundaries and intercept a large enemy convoy approaching Java. On the evening of March 1st, 1942, Perch surfaced about 30 nautical miles northwest of Soraya. She was running on the surface to make better speed when 2 Japanese destroyers cut directly across her path. They were fast, modern escorts built for blistering speed and armed with heavy torpedoes and dual-purpose guns. Lookouts on the nearest destroyer spotted Perch first, catching her silhouette against the dark sea. Without hesitation, the destroyer's 5-inch guns opened up. Shells streaked through the air and splashed dangerously close. Water exploded around Perch as the destroyer's fire fell fast and hard. There was no time to lose. Perch's captain ordered a crash dive, plunging the submarine into the dark depths to escape the hail of shells. Inside, the sublights flickered as she slipped beneath the surface. The crew leveled her off and tried to maneuver for a shot, closing to within roughly 800 to 2,000 yards, but the destroyers were already bearing down and setting up a depth charge run. Perch leveled off at about 90 feet to try to evade. 12 charges fell into the water, classic Type 95 depth charges, each carrying roughly 220 pounds of explosives set to detonate at measured depths. The first pattern missed, erupting aft, but 4 from the second pattern came very close. As they detonated, the pressure wave hammered Perch's hull. Rivets popped, steel plating groaned and bent, valves jammed, seals wept, gaskets tore loose. Water slid in through the hull. Gauges were wrecked and the port shaft lay lifeless. The margin for survival had narrowed to a thread. Up above, the destroyer circled once more and then moved off, assuming the submarine had broken up below them. That assumption was not accidental. As the depth charges hammered the hull, Lieutenant Commander Hurt ordered compressed air released from the ballast tanks while diesel fuel poured from open valves. The oil slick and the bubble field rose to the surface, classic signs of a sub breaking apart. Inside Perch, the crew kept absolute silence for 20 minutes while Japanese sonar pinged off the hull. Men barely breathed. Water dripped through sprung seams, but no one moved to patch them until the destroyer's engines faded into the distance. Perch was still going, just barely. The hull had held and internal bulkheads remained sealed. The crew stayed at emergency stations, managing trim and watching water levels. 2 hours later, just after midnight, Perch surfaced, clearly battered, but still fighting. She turned slowly east and the crew immediately began damage assessment. Hope clung to the wreck, but only if they could patch her up in time and vanish before the enemy circled back. Early on March 2nd, Perch lay on the surface, still reeling from the attack. Both periscope tubes were flooded and unusable, cutting off the submarine's eyes beneath the waves. Inside, only half of her main engines responded, severely limiting speed and maneuverability. The Japanese patrolled those waters aggressively. Any mistake could bring another attack. The men scrambled onto the rain-slicked deck without hesitation, knowing their survival depended on rapid repairs. Hull plating on the port side had been pushed inward between 18 and 24 inches, far beyond design tolerances. Chief machinist mates worked to shore up the warped metal with timber braces, knowing the weakened steel might buckle completely on the next dive. The 3-inch circulating waterline had ruptured, flooding the pump room. Without it, they could not cool the remaining engines properly, limiting them to short bursts of power before overheating. Broken ventilation valves were forced shut to prevent dangerous flooding of vital compartments. The engine room hatch leaked badly, threatening to swamp the machinery below. Open seams and torn gaskets were sealed with whatever materials were at hand. canvas, rubber, even wooden wedges. All of these makeshift fixes would have to hold under the immense pressure of the deep. Every movement carried urgency, and every sound risked detection. Working in darkness made the repairs a struggle. The ever-present threat of destroyers kept the crew tense and ready to dive at a moment's notice. Even though damaged systems made submerging slow and perilous, the crew quietly celebrated each patched seam and closed valve as a small victory. Each repair bought the submarine precious hours. Despite the damage, their spirit held firm. Their mission wasn't over. They still hoped to strike back at the Japanese convoy. Just before sunrise, the crew scrambled to wrap up repairs. Out of the gray horizon came two destroyers, modern and heavily armed, bristling with torpedo tubes and 5-inch guns. They had spotted Perch on the surface. Alarms blared and the crew rushed to dive stations, but the earlier depth charge barrage had crippled critical systems. Perch struggled to respond. Sluggish engines and flooded compartments slowed every move. She slipped beneath the waves, pushing down toward 200 feet, but the destroyers closed fast. They wasted no time, unleashing a fresh barrage of depth charges that pounded the water around Perch. Shockwaves slammed into the already battered hull. Systems groaned and failed, and the crew fought to control the boat. Their efforts were in vain. Propulsion failed completely and steering became unresponsive. Perch lay motionless in the deep, a sitting target. The destroyers pressed the attack, dropping pattern after pattern of charges. The assault continued well into daylight until the attackers finally pulled back, convinced their target was sunk. Water poured in from multiple breaches through the conning tower hatch, the engine room hatch, and leaking seams along the hull. The ruptured 3-inch circulating water line flooded critical compartments, and the pump strained against the rising tide. Inside, heat and humidity climbed, suffocating the crew and choking the engines. One by one, systems failed. The pressure hull filled with seawater, and the submarine's sluggish response made diving impossible. The officers gathered. There was no choice left. To stay submerged meant sinking deeper into darkness and flood. With heavy hearts, they ordered Perch to surface, exposing her battered frame to enemy eyes but buying a slim chance to live and fight another day. Damage control parties worked desperately, and after some time they managed to get one of her 4 engines running, just enough for 5 knots. Barely a slow, crippled drift on the surface. After covering a minimal distance, they attempted to dive again. Perch lurched uncontrollably as water poured in faster than it could be managed. The submarine pitched dangerously, nearly slipping beneath the waves without control. The crew fought desperately to avoid sinking outright. The grim truth settled in. Perch was now incapable of underwater travel and was forced to remain on the surface, exposed in enemy waters. Despite the damage and danger, the crew held on to the slim hope of escape or rescue. By evening, Perch was a crippled hulk, a survivor clinging to the hostile sea. One engine barely crawled. The rest lay silent. Gears were mangled, electrical systems shorted, and batteries leaked acid. The submarine's defenses had failed. The 4-inch deck gun was inoperative, and torpedoes damaged by depth charges were stuck in their tubes with firing mechanisms unsafe to use. Inside, heat and noxious gases mixed with exhaustion and frayed nerves. Scuttling had been discussed even before the attack, and the crew had prepared for it. The plan was clear. If Perch became unsalvageable and in danger of capture, she would be deliberately sunk to prevent enemy forces from seizing classified materials and technology. Still, every effort was made to buy time and keep the submarine afloat. They pushed on with desperate repairs, working on deck to patch leaks and close watertight hatches. Then, on the evening of March 3rd, the enemy returned. Searchlights swept the water and Ushio broke the tense silence. Her main battery roared and the first shell slammed into Perch's conning tower, tearing through what little remained of the battered structure. The blast shattered any hope of escape as damage deepened and systems failed fast. The order came: scuttle the submarine. Lieutenant Kenneth Shack led a team below to destroy codebooks and cipher machines. They smashed signal equipment beyond recognition while water rose around them. Hull valves were thrown open and seawater flooded in to claim the crippled vessel. Perch was being surrendered to the depths by her own crew. Shells screamed overhead as men raced to abandon ship, slipping into the cold water while enemy fire peppered the surface. Every second counted. Perch flooded fast and began her final descent. A slow, controlled plunge into the deep, marked the end of the boat and the end of the chance to capture a U.S. submarine and her secrets. All 59 men aboard Perch escaped before she slipped beneath the waves. Moments later, the Japanese destroyer Ushio hauled them from the water and they became prisoners of war. Taken to the newly occupied Dutch East Indies, they were sent to forced labor camps where they endured crushing work under brutal conditions for years. The war moved on, but they remained trapped, isolated, and forgotten. The U.S. Navy had no idea what had happened. In April 1942, Perch was listed as missing. Nearly a year later, a Japanese radio broadcast claimed some of the crew were being held on Shikoku, one of the home islands, but that was false. The real location, likely kept secret to avoid Allied bombing, was deep in occupied Indonesia. It was not until Japan's surrender in August 1945 that the truth finally surfaced. Most of Perch's crew had survived and had been prisoners in Southeast Asia all along. Despite the hardships most men endured, 5 or 6 succumbed, primarily to malnutrition and the brutal conditions of captivity. When the war ended on VJ Day, the survivors returned to their families, marked by the experience but alive. Lieutenant Kenneth Shack received the Navy Cross for his role during Perch's final moments. He helped oversee the scuttling to prevent the Japanese from capturing classified code books, materials, and equipment. Shack later explained how they had bought time. Loss of air and oil during attacks caused both previous enemy groups to believe their target had been destroyed. Perch's story was later dramatized in an episode of the television anthology series, The Silent Service, which aired in 1957-58. The wreck of Perch was discovered on November 23, 2006, Thanksgiving Day, by an international team of divers aboard MV Empress. It rested northwest of Bawan Island in the Java Sea. When news of the discovery reached 85-year-old survivor Robert Lent at his Arkansas home, he expressed keen interest in seeing what his boat looked like after all those years. Only 5 of Perch's crew were still alive by then. Lent added with dry humor, "I left $35 in my locker on the boat. It's probably still there. Because the entire crew abandoned ship and survived, the wreck is not considered a war grave." But as one of 52 U.S. submarines lost during World War II, USS Perch remains on eternal patrol.